The Young and the Restless Spoilers. The rhythmic, relentless slapping of the waves against the hull of the luxury yacht felt like a metronome counting down the final seconds of Jack Abbott's sanity. Inside the opulent, mahogany-paneled cabin, the air was thick, suffocating, heavily perfumed, with the cloying scent of Patty Williams's floral perfume and the sharp, undeniable tang of the drugged scotch lingering on Jack's tongue. His limbs felt like they were encased in wet cement. The sedative Patty had slipped into his drink was pulling him toward a dark, dreamless abyss, but the primal instinct to survive, to escape this nightmare, burned hotter than the chemical fire in his veins. Patty was humming a disjointed, eerie melody, her back turned to him as she meticulously arranged a bouquet of wildflowers she had somehow smuggled aboard. "It's going to be just like old times, Jack," she whispered to the empty room, her voice a chilling echo of a past he had spent decades trying to bury. "No Diane, no Victor, just us." Victor. The name pierced through the chemical fog in Jack's brain like a shard of ice. Victor Newman had done this. The Black Knight had orchestrated this grotesque reunion using a severely mentally ill woman as a pawn to humiliate and eliminate his oldest rival. Jack knew he had only a microscopic window of opportunity. Patty stepped out of the cabin, her erratic mind distracted by the sound of a seagull or perhaps a phantom voice calling her name from the deck. Jack bit the inside of his cheek, using the sharp spike of physical pain to anchor his consciousness. He forced his leaden legs to move, stumbling toward the narrow doorway. Every step was a monumental effort, a battle against the overwhelming gravity of the drug. He navigated the narrow corridor, his shoulder bouncing against the polished wood. The salty night air hit him like a physical blow as he emerged onto the aft deck. The darkness of Lake Michigan stretched out endlessly. Spotting the motorized dinghy secured to the stern, Jack's adrenaline surged. His hands trembling and clumsy fumbled with the thick nautical knots. Time was evaporating. At any moment, Patty would return, her delusion shattering into violent reality. With a final desperate heave, the ropes gave way. Jack lowered the small craft into the churning black water. He didn't dare start the engine, the roar would bring Patty running. Instead, he grabbed the emergency paddle, severed the mooring line with a safety knife from the emergency kit, and pushed away from the floating prison. As the yacht shrank into the foggy distance, Jack finally allowed his eyes to close, his body collapsing against the cold fiberglass hull as the current carried him away from madness. The journey back to Genoa City was a blur of freezing water, hitchhiked rides in the back of rusted pickup trucks, and a bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to shatter his soul. When Jack finally crossed the city limits, the sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the familiar streets. He was drenched, his once immaculate designer suit ruined, caked in dried salt and grime. He looked like a ghost, and for all intents and purposes, he needed to remain one. He could not go home. The Abbott mansion would be a focal point of panic. Diane would be frantic, pacing the floors, perhaps already calling the authorities. The thought of his wife's terror twisted a knife in his gut, but Jack knew that returning to her arms right now would only make them both targets. Victor Newman was a grand master of manipulation. If Victor knew Jack had escaped the board, he would immediately adapt, launching a counteroffensive that Jack, in his current weakened state, could not repel. No, Jack needed the element of surprise. He needed the shadows. He found refuge in a dilapidated cash-only motel on the absolute fringes of the city, a place where questions were never asked and the neon sign outside buzzed with a dying, erratic rhythm. Collapsing onto the lumpy mattress, Jack stared at the water-stained ceiling. The physical toll of the escape was immense. His muscles screamed in agony, and the residual effects of Patty's sedative still made the room spin if he turned his head too fast. But beneath the exhaustion, a terrifying, beautiful clarity began to take shape. The embers of his resentment toward Victor Newman had been fanned into a raging, uncontrollable inferno. Victor had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. To kidnap him, to hand him over to a woman whose obsession had nearly destroyed his life decades ago, it was a cruelty so profound it demanded biblical retribution. Jack didn't just want to beat Victor in the boardroom anymore. He wanted to dismantle the man's entire existence. He wanted to burn the Newman Empire to the ground and salt the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. For 3 days, the motel room served as Jack's war room. He procured a cheap burner phone, a high-powered, untraceable laptop, and enough black coffee to keep a small army awake. He remained entirely off the grid, a ghost haunting the digital ether. Jack began his meticulous reconnaissance. He hacked into the peripheral servers of Newman Enterprises, a back door he had discovered years ago and kept in his back pocket for a rainy day. This was a torrential downpour. He sifted through thousands of encrypted emails, financial ledgers, and executive itineraries. He needed to know exactly what Victor had been doing while he was supposedly on ice. The picture that emerged was one of typical Newman hubris, but with glaring, uncharacteristic blind spots. Victor was distracted. He had recently ordered his wife, Nikki, off the ranch, a massive domestic fracture that Jack knew would deeply unsettle the Newman patriarch, no matter how stoic he pretended to be. Furthermore, Victor was deeply entangled in a chaotic situation involving Adam, Nick, and a mission to Las Vegas to neutralize a threat named Matt Clark. Victor's forces were divided. His attention was split across multiple fronts, his arrogance blinding him to the vulnerability of his own flanks. He believed Jack was neutralized, safely tucked away in Patty Williams' delusional fantasy. "You underestimated me, Victor," Jack whispered to the glowing screen, his voice raspy from disuse. "You thought I was just a soft country club executive. You forgot who I really am." Jack meticulously cataloged every recent acquisition Newman Enterprises had made. He looked for over-leveraged assets, disgruntled board members, and fragile supply chains. He compiled a dossier of destruction, a blueprint that would strike at the very heart of Victor's legacy. But to execute a plan of this magnitude, he needed boots on the ground. He needed an ally who could operate in the daylight while Jack ruled the dark. The underground parking garage beneath the Genoa City Athletic Club was damp and smelled faintly of motor oil and old rain. Jack waited in the deepest shadows, the collar of his dark trench coat pulled up against the chill. He checked his watch. 2:00 a.m. Footsteps echoed against the concrete. Billy Abbott emerged from the stairwell looking haggard, his eyes scanning the gloom. Billy had been relentlessly searching for Jack, tearing up the marina with Diane, and Kyle chasing the beacon signal of the yacht. "Over here," Billy Jack said softly. Billy spun around his hand, instinctively reaching into his jacket before he recognized the voice. He froze, his eyes widening in absolute shock as Jack stepped into the dim pool of light cast by a flickering overhead bulb. "Jack," Billy breathed, closing the distance in 3 long strides. He grabbed his brother by the shoulders as if testing to see if he was a mirage. "My God, Jack, you're alive. Diane is out of her mind. Kyle is ready to tear the city apart. We tracked the yacht, we knew Patty had you." "Listen to me, Billy," Jack interrupted his voice, a low, commanding growl that stopped his brother's frantic rambling. "I need you to listen very carefully. I am dead. As far as the world is concerned, as far as Diane and Kyle are concerned, I am still missing." Billy recoiled, confusion contorting his features. "What are you talking about, Jack? You have to go home. Diane is suffering. She slapped you on that boat because she thought—" "I know what she thought." Jack snapped the memory of Diane's horrified face when she caught him in a drug-induced stupor with Patty flashing painfully in his mind. "And I will spend the rest of my life making it up to her. But if I reveal myself now, Victor wins." "Victor orchestrated this, Billy. He put me on that yacht. He handed me over to Patty." Billy's jaw tightened, the familiar Abbott rage flaring in his eyes. "That son of a bitch." "Exactly," Jack said, gripping Billy's arm. "Victor thinks he has the upper hand. He thinks I'm out of the game. I need to use his arrogance against him, but I can't do it alone. I need you to be my proxy. I need you to move money, forge signatures, and set the traps I'm designing. Can you do this? Can you lie to Diane and Kyle for just a little longer to help me destroy the man who did this to our family?" Billy stared at his brother. He saw the dark bags under Jack's eyes, the ruthless set of his jaw, the absolute absence of the affable Jabbo CEO. This was a man at war. Billy nodded slowly. "Tell me what you need." With Billy acting as his physical conduit, Jack's safe house transformed into a command center. The walls were soon covered in printed schematics, organizational charts of Newman Enterprises, and photographs of Victor's inner circle, all connected by a web of red string. Jack's plan was a masterpiece of corporate sabotage, designed not just to inflict financial damage, but to induce psychological terror. He knew that attacking Victor head-on was a fool's errand. Victor thrived in open combat. To defeat the Black Knight, one had to poison the water supply, cut the supply lines, and turn his own soldiers against him. Phase 1 targeted Newman's newest international shipping acquisitions. Jack identified a critical logistical hub in Singapore that was currently undergoing a massive software integration. It was highly vulnerable. Phase 2 was personal. Jack knew that Nikki's expulsion from the Newman ranch was a festering wound. Victor's stoicism was a facade. Without Nikki, his emotional foundation was cracked. Jack planned to exploit this by feeding Nikki anonymous, undeniable proof of Victor's darkest, most recent machinations. Things even she, with her infinite capacity for forgiveness, could not stomach. He would isolate Victor completely. Phase 3 involved the SEC. Jack had uncovered a series of shell companies Victor had used to aggressively short the stock of a competitor before a hostile takeover. It was illegal, highly unethical, and buried deep. Jack began compiling the data packets, preparing to send them to the most aggressive federal prosecutors in Chicago. "We hit him everywhere at once," Jack explained to Billy over an encrypted video call. We don't give him time to breathe, to assess, or to counterattack. We make him feel like the walls of his own castle are closing in on him. Billy smirked through the screen. It's brilliant, Jack. It's ruthless. It's very Victor. No, Jack corrected him, his eyes cold and dead. It's better than Victor, because he won't see it coming. The execution of the plan was flawless. It began on a Tuesday morning, a day that started like any other in the towering glass monolith of Newman Enterprises. At 9:00 a.m., the Singapore logistics hub went dark. A highly sophisticated, untraceable malware purchased by Billy on the dark web using offshore Abbott funds wiped the shipping manifests of 36 cargo freighters carrying billions of dollars in Newman assets. The ships were stranded in the water, unable to dock, unload, or process their cargo. The financial hemorrhage was immediate and catastrophic. At 11:30 a.m., an anonymous package was delivered to Nikki Newman at her temporary residence. Inside was a flash drive containing unredacted audio files of Victor's security chief discussing the payoff to the men who had transported Patty Williams to the yacht. It was irrefutable proof of his monstrous betrayal. Within an hour, Nikki's lawyers were drafting aggressively revised separation agreements, and her furious, tearful voicemail to Victor was a masterpiece of emotional devastation. At 2:00 p.m., the SEC officially announced a surprise sweeping investigation into Newman Enterprises' recent acquisitions, freezing several key subsidiary accounts and sending the company's stock plummeting by 8% in a matter of minutes. Jack sat in the dim light of his motel room watching the financial news networks erupt in a frenzy of speculation. The talking heads were baffled. Newman Enterprises, the untouchable titan of the corporate world, was suddenly bleeding from a dozen different wounds. Jack took a sip of his black coffee. The bitter taste was suddenly the sweetest thing he had ever experienced. The chaos had been sown. The seeds of destruction were taking root. High above the panic of the trading floor, in the cavernous, imposing executive office of Newman Enterprises, Victor Newman stood perfectly still. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture rigid as he stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Genoa city skyline. The city looked the same, but the tectonic plates beneath his empire were violently shifting. His desk phone was flashing with a dozen urgent calls. Victoria was demanding answers about the SEC. Adam was calling from Vegas, sensing the blood in the water. The logistics division was in full meltdown. Victor did not panic. Panic was an emotion reserved for the weak, the unprepared, but a dark, suffocating paranoia was beginning to coil tightly in his chest. He turned away from the window and walked over to his desk, slamming his fist down on the polished wood with a resounding crack. "Get me my security chief!" Now he bellowed into the intercom. When the chief arrived, looking pale and sweating profusely, Victor didn't offer him a seat. "Explain this to me," Victor demanded, his voice a lethal, vibrating baritone. "How does the secure server in Singapore go offline? How does the SEC suddenly possess documents that were buried in encrypted vaults? And who in the hell is sending packages to my wife?" "Sir, we're looking into it," the chief stammered. "It's a coordinated attack, highly sophisticated. The digital footprints are masked, bouncing through servers in Eastern Europe and South America. We can't pinpoint the source." Victor's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. This wasn't a random act of corporate espionage. This was a symphony of destruction, orchestrated by a maestro who intimately knew his vulnerabilities. "Someone is playing games with me," Victor growled, pacing the length of his office like a caged lion. He mentally reviewed his list of enemies. Matt Clark. No, Matt was a street brawler, not a corporate sniper. Tucker McCall, too busy with his own messes. The precision, the timing, the sheer unadulterated malice of the attack, it felt deeply personal. It felt like an Abbott. But Jack Abbott was gone. Jack was trapped in a sedated nightmare on a yacht in the middle of nowhere, courtesy of Patty Williams. Victor had ensured it. He had received confirmation. Unless... Victor stopped pacing. A cold chill ran down his spine. "Contact the men watching the marina." Victor ordered, his voice suddenly terrifyingly quiet. "I want eyes on that yacht. I want visual confirmation of Jack Abbott. Now." As the security chief scrambled out of the office, Victor looked back out the window. The sky was darkening, heavy storm clouds gathering over the lake. He realized with a sinking feeling of absolute certainty that he had made a fatal miscalculation. The beast was not caged. The beast was loose, and it was hunting him. Miles away in the squalid motel room that had become his fortress, Jack Abbott stood before the mirror. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. The soft edges of the billionaire playboy had been chiseled away by trauma, betrayal, and an all-consuming thirst for vengeance. His eyes were hard, flinty, and completely devoid of mercy. He looked down at the burner phone on the dresser. Billy had just texted him a single word times checkmate, asterisk. The first phase was complete. Victor was bleeding, paranoid and isolated, but Jack knew this was only the opening skirmish in what would be a long, brutal war. Victor would regroup. He would hunt the source of the attacks with the ruthless efficiency that had made him a legend. Jack welcomed it. He wanted Victor to look for him. He wanted Victor to realize that the man he had tried to destroy had returned as his executioner. Jack picked up a physical photograph of Victor he had pinned to his murder board. He stared at the arrogant, self-assured face of his lifelong tormentor. He thought of Diane, weeping in confusion. He thought of the terror of waking up paralyzed on that yacht. He thought of the decades of underhanded, vicious attacks his family had suffered at the hands of the Newmans. "You wanted a war," Victor Jack whispered to the empty room, his voice echoing with a dark, terrifying promise. "You thought you could bury me alive. But you only succeeded in burying the man I used to be." He struck a match, the sudden flare of light illuminating his hardened features. He held the flame to the corner of Victor's photograph, watching impassively as the fire consumed the image, turning the arrogant face into curling black ash. "I am going to expose every lie you've ever told," Jack vowed, dropping the burning remains into a metal ashtray. "I am going to strip you of your company, your family, and your dignity. I will reclaim my life, my throne, and my justice. And when I am finished, Victor Newman will be nothing more than a cautionary tale." Jack Abbott grabbed his trench coat and walked out into the stormy Genoa City night. The ghost was finally ready to make himself known. The real game had just begun.